It begins with a sound. A small, steady pulse, traveling through the darkness of space, reaching the atmosphere, reaching the ground, reaching the antennas of radio operators across the world.
Beep, beep, beep.
It is the 4th of October, 1957, and that sound is coming from above, from an object the size of a basketball, weighing 83 kilograms, traveling at 28,000 kilometers per hour in orbit around the Earth. The Soviet Union has just launched the world's first artificial satellite. They call it Sputnik, a Russian word meaning traveling companion or fellow traveler. For the United States of America, it feels like anything but companionable. It feels like a defeat, a shock, a warning. If the Soviets can put an object into orbit around the Earth, they can put a nuclear warhead over any city in America. The implications are immediate. They are military, they are political, they are existential. The American public looks up at the night sky and wonders what else is up there, what else the Soviets might be planning. In Washington, there is panic, and then there is purpose. Something must be done. A response must be made. America cannot be second in space, cannot be second in anything. From that panic, from that wounded pride, from the cold certainty that the world has changed in a single night, something extraordinary is born. Tonight, we follow the story of what that something becomes, from its frightened beginnings in the autumn of 1957 to its most historic mission in the spring of 2026. Slowly, calmly, from the very beginning. Close your eyes if you wish. We are going to space. We continue our story. In the months after Sputnik, America scrambles. The United States military already has its own rocket programs. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, each working separately, each with its own rockets, its own goals, its own vision of what space exploration should look like. But a military space program raises difficult questions about the militarization of space, about how other nations will perceive America's intentions, about what kind of country America wants to be in this new era. President Dwight Eisenhower makes a decision. America's space program will be civilian, open, transparent, dedicated to peaceful exploration and the benefit of all humanity. Not a secret military operation, not a weapons program in disguise. On the 29th of July, 1958, Eisenhower signs the National Aeronautics and Space Act. A new agency is created, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. It opens for business on the 1st of October 1958, built on the foundation of an older research body called the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which had been studying flight since 1915. It inherits its engineers, its wind tunnels, its test facilities, and its culture of meticulous research. The new agency has about 8,000 employees, a modest budget, and an immodest mission: to explore space for the benefit of all humankind. The first administrator is T. Keith Glennon, a quiet, competent man who understands that what he is building is something the world has never seen before. In our next chapter, the new agency introduces the people who will carry it into the unknown. Rest now, the story continues. We continue our story. It is April 9, 1959. A press conference in Washington. A room full of journalists, cameras, flashbulbs. The kind of attention that usually surrounds politicians and film stars. But the 7 men who walk in are neither. They are military test pilots, men who have spent their careers flying experimental aircraft at the edges of what is possible. Men accustomed to risk, to making decisions in fractions of a second, to trusting instruments and instinct equally. NASA introduces them to the world. Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, Wally Schirra, Gordon Cooper, Dake Slayton. The Mercury Seven, America's first astronauts. The room erupts. Reporters who have covered wars and elections and disasters find themselves on their feet, applauding. Something about these men touches something deep in the American imagination. They are volunteers going somewhere no American has ever gone on a machine that has never carried a human being for a country that is behind in a race it cannot afford to lose. Each of them has been selected from an extraordinary process. Physical tests, psychological tests, tests of endurance and judgment, and nerve of hundreds of candidates. These 7 have passed. They become celebrities overnight. Their faces appear on magazines. Their families are profiled in newspapers. Children across America write their names in school books and dream of joining them in the sky. But the sky is not where they are going. They are going higher, much higher. In our next chapter, a young president gives them a destination that stops the breath of a nation. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. It is the 5th of May, 1961. Alan Shepard climbs into a capsule called Freedom 7. Barely large enough to contain a seated man, sitting atop a Redstone rocket at Cape Canaveral, Florida. He has been waiting for hours, delays, technical issues. The kind of morning that tests the nerves of even the most composed of men. At 9:34 in the morning, the rocket ignites, and Alan Shepard becomes the first American in space. His flight lasts 15 minutes and 28 seconds. A brief arc above the atmosphere, not an orbit. The Soviets had already orbited. Yuri Gagarin 3 weeks before. America is still behind. But Shepard is in space, and the nation exhales. 20 days later, President John F. Kennedy stands before a joint session of Congress. He is 43 years old, young, eloquent, a man who understands the power of a clear, bold commitment. He speaks about the challenge facing the United States, about the space race, about what it means for America's standing in the world. And then he says something that will define the next decade of human history. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. The room is quiet for a moment, and then it erupts. A man on the moon before 1970. NASA has 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience. The moon is 384,000 kilometers away. No one has any clear idea how to get there. But the goal has been set in public before Congress, before the world. And NASA will spend the rest of the decade figuring out how. In our next chapter, the first American circles the Earth, and the impossible begins to feel possible. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. It is the 20th of February, 1962. Cape Canaveral, Florida. A cold and clear morning. John Glenn sits inside a capsule called Friendship 7, waiting, as he has been waiting for weeks. This mission has been postponed 10 times. Weather technical issues, the endless complications of sending a human being into orbit. For the first time in American history. Glenn is 37 years old, a Marine fighter pilot who flew combat missions in 2 wars. Quiet, steady, precise, the kind of man who inspires confidence simply by entering a room. At 9:47 in the morning, the Atlas rocket beneath him ignites. Friendship 7 rises through the Florida sky, through the clouds, through the atmosphere, and into the black. John Glenn is in orbit. He circles the Earth 3 times, 4 hours and 55 minutes, traveling at 28,000 kilometers per hour, watching the sun rise and set 3 times in a single morning. He describes what he sees: the curvature of the Earth, the thinness of the atmosphere, how fragile it looks, how beautiful. A blue line at the edge of the world, so thin, so precious. Across America, 4 million people line the streets of New York to welcome him home. It is one of the largest ticker tape parades in the city's history. The space race is not over. The Soviets are still ahead, in many ways. But America has found its footing, its confidence, its belief that the goal Kennedy has set is within reach. In our next chapter, the bridge program begins, the training ground for everything that comes next. Rest now, the story continues. We continue our story. Kennedy has made his promise, a man on the moon, before the end of the decade. But between where NASA is and where it needs to be, there is an enormous gap. To land on the moon, astronauts will need to spend days in space, not minutes, not hours, days. They will need to rendezvous with another spacecraft in orbit, to dock, to transfer between vehicles, to work outside their capsule, in the vacuum of space, in a suit, with nothing between them and the infinite dark, but layers of fabric and pressure. None of these things have ever been done before. Project Gemini is designed to learn how. Named for the Latin word for twins because the capsule carries two. A pilot, a commander working together, testing the systems that Apollo will need. Between 1964 and 1966, NASA launches 10 crewed Gemini missions, each one building on what the last one learned. On the 3rd of June, 1965, astronaut Ed White opens his hatch and floats out into space. The first American spacewalk. White floats above the Earth, tethered by a golden cord, the planet turning beneath him, blue and white and impossibly beautiful. When mission control tells him it is time to come back in, he says, "This is the saddest moment of my life." In December 1965, Gemini Visai and Gemini Visai performed the first rendezvous between two spacecraft, flying within a foot of each other, in orbit. The techniques are being mastered, one by one, mission by mission. The moon is getting closer, but first, a fire, and 3 men who will never fly again. In our next chapter, the darkness arrives. Rest now, the story continues. We continue our story. It is the 27th of January, 1967. Launch Complex 34, Cape Kennedy, Florida. 3 astronauts are running a routine test, a pre-flight simulation. No fuel in the rocket, no launch planned for today, just a test. Just a rehearsal for what comes next. Gus Grissom, one of the original Mercury 7, the second American in space, A man who has been to space twice and is preparing for his third flight. Ed White, the first American to walk in space. The man who said that leaving space was the saddest moment of his life. Roger Chaffee, young 26 years old, about to fly his first mission. They are sealed inside the Apollo 1 command module, strapped in their seats, running through checklists. The test has been frustrating. Communications problems, delays, the kind of day that tests patience more than nerves. At 6:31 in the evening, a spark. Inside the capsule, the atmosphere is pure oxygen at higher than normal pressure. A fire in pure oxygen does not burn, it explodes. In less than 30 seconds, the 3 men inside are gone. Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee. The investigation that follows reveals failures in the design, in the materials, in the culture of pressure to meet Kennedy's deadline. NASA stops. For 20 months, no American goes to space. Engineers rebuild the capsule, redesign the atmosphere, replace flammable materials, ask the hardest questions about what went wrong and why. When NASA flies again, it flies better, more carefully, with a greater understanding of what it means to ask human beings to sit atop a rocket. The 3 men are not forgotten. They never will be. In our next chapter, the program resumes and humanity sees its home planet from somewhere. It has never seen it before. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. It is December 1968, one of the most turbulent years in American history is drawing to a close. Martin Luther King has been assassinated. Robert Kennedy has been assassinated. Cities have burned. The war in Vietnam is consuming lives and dividing a nation. The world feels broken. And then, on the 21st of December, 3 men climb into a spacecraft and leave. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, Bill Anders, the crew of Apollo 8, the first humans to leave. The gravitational influence of Earth, the first to travel to another world. They are not landing on the moon. This mission is to orbit it, to test the navigation, the systems, the procedures, to prove it can be done before Apollo 11 attempts the landing. On Christmas Eve, they enter lunar orbit, and they look down at the surface of the moon, gray and ancient and still, a landscape that has not changed in billions of years. And then Bill Anders looks up and sees something no human being has ever seen. The Earth, rising above the lunar horizon, blue and white, fragile and luminous, impossibly alone in the absolute darkness of space. He reaches for his camera. The photograph he takes becomes one of the most reproduced and most studied images in human history. Earthrise. That evening, the three astronauts broadcast to Earth, the most watched television program in history to that point. And they take turns reading from the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. From the surface of the moon on Christmas Eve to a fractured world that suddenly sees itself as one small, precious thing. In our next chapter, they go back, and this time, they land. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. It is the 20th of July, 1969. 8 years. 8 years since Kennedy stood before Congress and made his promise. 8 years of Mercury and Gemini, of fires and failures, of 24-hour shifts and calculations done on slide rules and chalkboards, of engineers who slept at their desks and dreamed about trajectories. 3 men orbit the moon: Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, the crew of Apollo 11. Collins stays in the command module, orbiting above, alone, the most isolated human being in the history of the species. Armstrong and Aldrin descend in the lunar module, a spidery, fragile-looking craft called Eagle, designed for one purpose: to land 2 men on the moon and bring them back. The descent is not smooth. Alarms sound in the cockpit. The computer is overloaded. The landing site is strewn with boulders. Armstrong takes manual control, flies past the target, searching for somewhere safe. With less than 30 seconds of fuel remaining, Eagle touches down. The sea of tranquility, the moon. Armstrong's voice comes through the static. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. At Mission Control in Houston, men who have not cried in years are crying. Hours later, Armstrong climbs down the ladder of the lunar module and places his boot on the surface of the moon. That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. 600 million people watch on television, the largest audience in human history. Kennedy's promise fulfilled with 5 months to spare. In our next chapter, NASA faces a different kind of challenge. Not triumph, survival. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. It is the 11th of April 1970. Apollo 13 lifts off from Cape Kennedy. The third mission, intended to land on the moon. The crew is 3 men: Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, Fred Hayes, experienced, confident, ready for another landing. 2 days into the mission, everything changes. At 55 hours and 54 minutes into the flight, a fault in an oxygen tank causes an explosion in the service module. The spacecraft shudders. Warning lights flood the cockpit. Systems begin to fail. Power, oxygen, water. The things that keep human beings alive in space. Jim Lovell looks out the window and sees something no astronaut wants to see. Gas venting into space from the side of his spacecraft. He reports to Mission Control. Houston, we've had a problem. The moon is no longer the destination. Home is, and getting there with a damaged spacecraft and dwindling resources is not guaranteed. The 3 astronauts abandon the command module. They move into the lunar module, a small craft designed to land 2 men on the moon for 2 days, not to keep 3 men alive for 4 days on a journey back to Earth. NASA does something it has rarely had to do before. It improvises. Engineers on the ground work without sleep, calculating trajectories, designing workarounds, building a carbon dioxide scrubber from materials on board, using only what the crew has available: tape, plastic bags, a sock. The crew is cold. The temperature in the capsule drops near freezing. They drink barely any water to conserve it. They do not sleep. On the 17th of April, Apollo 13 splashes down in the Pacific Ocean, all 3 astronauts alive. NASA calls it a successful failure, a mission that never reached the moon, but showed what human beings and human ingenuity can accomplish when there is no other choice. In our next chapter, the moon landings continue, and then they end in a way that surprises almost everyone. Rest now, the story continues. We continue our story. Between July 1969 and December 1972, 12 human beings walk on the moon. 12. They drive a lunar rover across the surface. They collect rocks. They conduct experiments. They plant flags. They hit a golf ball. They leave behind instruments that are still sending data to Earth decades later. Each mission pushes further, stays longer, learns more. And then comes Apollo 17, December 1972, the last mission. The crew is Eugene Cernan, Harrison Schmitt, and Ronald Evans. Schmidt is a geologist, the first trained scientist to walk on the moon. He collects samples with the precision of someone who knows exactly what he is looking for. On the 14th of December 1972, Eugene Cernan prepares to climb back into the lunar module. He is the last man standing on the surface. He knows this moment. He has thought about it. He scratches his daughter's initials into the lunar soil. TDC. Tracy Dawn Cernan, where they will remain for millions of years, undisturbed in the airless stillness of the moon. And then he says, "We leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return with peace and hope for all mankind." He climbs the ladder, the hatch closes, and no human being sets foot on the moon again for more than 50 years. In our next chapter, NASA built something it has never built before, a machine meant to fly again and again. A reusable spacecraft, the Space Shuttle. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. The moon landings are over. 12 men have walked on another world. And now NASA must answer a different question. What comes next? The rockets of Apollo were extraordinary, but they were disposable, each one used once and then gone. Fallen into the ocean, burned in the atmosphere, at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars per flight. NASA imagined something different. A spacecraft that flies to orbit and comes back, that lands on a runway like an airplane, that can be refueled and reflown again and again, making access to space routine, affordable, reliable. They call it the Space Shuttle. On the 12th of April, 1981, exactly 20 years after Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, Space Shuttle Columbia sits on the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center. Astronauts John Young and Bob Crippen climb aboard. Young is a veteran of Gemini and Apollo, one of the most experienced astronauts in NASA's history. Crippen is flying for the first time. The engines ignite, the solid rocket boosters light, and Columbia rises. It is unlike anything the world has seen. A winged spacecraft, part rocket, part airplane, carried into orbit by the most powerful engines ever built for a crewed vehicle. 2 days later, Columbia glides back through the atmosphere and lands on the dry lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Like an airplane. The crowd watching cannot quite believe what they are seeing. A new era of spaceflight has begun, or so it seems. In our next chapter, the promise of routine spaceflight meets a cold January morning, and everything changes. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. The moon landings are over. 12 men have walked on another world. And now NASA must answer a different question. What comes next? The rockets of Apollo were extraordinary, but they were disposable, each one used once and then gone. Fallen into the ocean, burned in the atmosphere, at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars per flight. NASA imagines something different. A spacecraft that flies to orbit and comes back, that lands on a runway like an airplane, that can be refueled and reflown again and again, making access to space routine, affordable, reliable. They call it the Space Shuttle. On the 12th of April, 1981, exactly 20 years after Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, Space Shuttle Columbia sits on the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center. Astronauts John Young and Bob Crippen climb aboard. Young is a veteran of Gemini and Apollo, one of the most experienced astronauts in NASA's history. Crippen is flying for the first time. The engines ignite, the solid rocket boosters light, and Columbia rises. It is unlike anything the world has seen. A winged spacecraft, part rocket, part airplane, carried into orbit by the most powerful engines ever built for a crewed vehicle. 2 days later, Columbia glides back through the atmosphere and lands on the dry lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base in California, like an airplane. The crowd watching cannot quite believe what they are seeing. A new era of spaceflight has begun, or so it seems. In our next chapter, the promise of routine spaceflight meets a cold January morning, and everything changes. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. The moon landings are over. 12 men have walked on another world. And now NASA must answer a different question. What comes next? We continue our story. It is the 28th of January, 1986. A Tuesday morning, Cape Kennedy, Florida. The temperature overnight has dropped far below freezing. Ice is formed on the launch structure. Engineers at a company called Morton Thiokol have spent the night on the phone with NASA managers, warning them, pleading with them. The O-rings that seal the joints of the solid rocket boosters are not certified to fly in such cold weather. The managers listen and decide to launch anyway. Space Shuttle Challenger sits on the pad. Mission STS-51L, the 25th flight of the Space Shuttle program. 7 astronauts are on board. Commander Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, and Ronald McNair, payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe. A school teacher from New Hampshire, selected from 11,000 applicants to be the first teacher in space to teach lessons from orbit. to children across America. Millions of those children are watching, in classrooms and gymnasiums, gathered around televisions to see their teacher go to space. At 11:38 in the morning, Challenger lifts off. It rises beautifully through the cold blue sky. 73 seconds later, the O-ring fails. A plume of flame breaches the seal. The external fuel tank ruptures. In less than a second, Challenger is gone. A white cloud, two solid rocket boosters spiraling away from a point in the sky where a spacecraft used to be. The children watching do not understand what they are seeing. The teachers watching understand too well. NASA stops flying for 32 months. The investigation that follows reveals not just a technical failure, but a failure of culture, of communication, of an organization that had learned to accept risk it should never have accepted. 7 names added to the list of those who gave everything. In our next chapter, NASA looks up and builds an eye that can see to the edge of the universe. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. On the 24th of April, 1990, Space Shuttle Discovery carries something extraordinary into orbit. A telescope, 13.2 meters long, 4.2 meters wide, weighing 11,000 kilograms, named after the astronomer Edwin Hubble, who in the 1920s discovered that the universe extends far beyond our own galaxy, that the Milky Way is just one of billions. The Hubble Space Telescope is designed to see what no telescope on Earth can see. Because Earth has an atmosphere, a shimmering, distorting veil of air that blurs the light arriving from distant stars. Above the atmosphere, the view is perfect, sharp, clear, infinite. Or it should be. When scientists examine the first images from Hubble, they find something wrong. The primary mirror has been ground to the wrong shape by a tiny fraction, 1/50th of the width of a human hair. The most expensive telescope ever built is blurry. The embarrassment is enormous. The jokes are immediate. Late-night hosts spend weeks on the material. But NASA does not give up. In December 1993, astronauts aboard Space Shuttle Endeavour perform one of the most complex and daring repair missions in the history of spaceflight. 5 spacewalks, 11 days in orbit, installing corrective optics that function like glasses for a nearsighted eye. When the new images come back, the room at NASA falls completely silent. The universe, in perfect, breathtaking detail, nebulae that look like cathedrals of gas and dust,
Galaxies colliding in slow motion. Over millions of years. Stars being born. Stars dying. Light that has traveled for billions of years to reach a mirror orbiting the Earth. Hubble does not just take photographs. It changes the way humanity understands where it lives and how vast and ancient and strange that place truly is. In our next chapter, tragedy returns, and NASA must reckon with itself again. Rest now. The story continues.
We continue our story. It is the 1st of February, 2003. A Saturday morning. Space Shuttle Columbia is coming home. STS-7, the 113th flight of the Space Shuttle program. 16 days in orbit, a crew of 7 conducting scientific experiments, ready to land, ready to see their families, ready for breakfast on the ground. Commander Rick Husband, Pilot William McCool, Mission Specialists Michael Anderson, David Brown, Kalpana Chawla, and Laurel Clark, and Elin Ramon. The first Israeli astronaut carrying with him a drawing made by a child in a Nazi concentration camp, a picture of the Earth as seen from the moon. At 8:59 in the morning, controllers on the ground notice something. Temperature readings from the left wing are dropping off, one sensor than another. Then silence. Columbia does not land. 16 days earlier, during launch, a piece of insulating foam had broken free from the external fuel tank and struck the leading edge of the left wing, punching a hole in the heat shield tiles. Engineers had raised concerns, had asked for satellite images of the damage, had been told it was probably fine. It was not fine. As Columbia descended through the atmosphere at 27,000 kilometers per hour, superheated air poured through the hole in the wing and tore the spacecraft apart over Texas and Louisiana in the morning sky. 7 names added to the others: the Apollo 1 crew, the Challenger crew, the people who gave everything. NASA stops flying again for 2.5 years. And when it flies again, it carries with it a heavier understanding of what it costs, of what it asks of those who climb into spacecraft and trust the people on the ground to bring them home. In our next chapter, NASA turns its eyes to another world entirely. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. There is another world that has fascinated humanity since ancient times. Red, cold, distant, a planet that glows like an ember in the night sky, named after the Roman god of war, Mars. For decades, NASA has been sending machines to explore it. First flybys, then orbiters, then landers, probes that touch down on the rust-colored surface and send back images of a world that is both alien and strangely familiar. Flat plains of ancient rock, dust storms that swallow entire hemispheres, a sky the color of a sunset that never ends, and silence. A silence so complete, it is almost impossible to imagine. In January 2004, 2 rovers land on Mars, Spirit and Opportunity, small 6-wheeled about the size of a golf cart, designed to operate for 90 days. Spirit operates for 6 years, Opportunity for 15. They roll across the Martian surface, examining rocks, analyzing soil, taking photographs of sunsets on another planet of their own wheel tracks in the ancient dust. They find evidence of liquid water, ancient riverbeds, minerals that only form in the presence of water, raising the question that humanity has asked for centuries. Was there ever life on Mars? In 2012, a larger rover named Curiosity descends through the thin Martian atmosphere, slowed by a parachute, lowered on cables by a hovering rocket platform. The most complex landing in the history of planetary exploration. It works. In 2021, a small helicopter named Ingenuity lifts off from the Martian surface, the first powered flight on another planet, a moment as significant in its own way as the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk. Mars is no longer just a point of light in the night sky. It is a place, a destination, perhaps one day, a home. In our next chapter, humanity builds its first permanent home in space. Rest now, the story continues. Rest now, the story continues. We continue our story. 400 kilometers above the Earth, moving at 28,000 kilometers per hour, circling the planet once every 90 minutes, 16 sunrises every day. The International Space Station. It is the largest structure humanity has ever placed in space. The size of a football field, a pressurized living and working volume, equivalent to a 6-bedroom house, built piece by piece over 13 years by astronauts working in the vacuum of space, with tools designed for hands encased in gloves so thick they can barely feel them. Construction began in 1998. The first crew arrived in November 2000. And since that day, not a single moment has passed when human beings have not been living in space. More than 25 years continuously, without interruption. The station is not a single country's achievement. It is the work of 15 nations. The United States, Russia, Japan, Canada, the member states of the European Space Agency. Countries that have competed, that have disagreed, that have looked at each other
across the divide of politics and ideology and history, and built something together that none of them could have built alone. Aboard the station, astronauts conduct experiments that cannot be done on Earth, where gravity changes everything. They study how the human body responds to long-duration spaceflight, how materials behave in microgravity, how fire burns differently when there is no convection, how plants grow when there is no up or down. Every experiment a step, every step towards somewhere further. In our next chapter, a new age of space exploration begins, and the companies that were once watching from the outside become part of the story. Rest now, the story continues.
We continue our story. In 2011, the Space Shuttle makes its final flight. Atlantis lands at Kennedy Space Center on the 21st of July. 135 missions, 30 years of service, 14 lives lost, and an era ends. For the next 9 years, NASA has no way to launch its own astronauts. American crews fly to the International Space Station aboard Russian Soyuz rockets, paying tens of millions of dollars per seat for the privilege of reaching a station they helped build. But something else is happening. A new generation of companies is looking at space and seeing not just exploration, but possibility, commerce industry, a frontier. A company called SpaceX, founded by a man named Elon Musk, begins building rockets. Rockets designed not just to fly, but to land, to return to Earth, and fly again. Reusable, reliable, affordable. Everything the shuttle promised to be, and never quite became. In May 2020, a SpaceX Crew Dragon capsule launches from Kennedy Space Center, carrying 2 NASA astronauts, Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken, to the International Space Station. America is launching astronauts again from American soil on an American rocket, but one built not by NASA, by a private company. The relationship between NASA and the new commercial space industry is a partnership. NASA focuses on the deep, on the moon, on Mars, on the James Webb Space Telescope. Launched in December 2021, a telescope so powerful, it can see the first galaxies that formed after the Big Bang, looking back 13 billion years into the history of the universe. While private companies handle the routine, the trips to low Earth orbit, the resupply missions, the cargo runs. Space is becoming something new, not just a destination for governments and heroes, but a place where humanity is beginning to live and work. In our final chapter, a rocket rises again toward the moon for the first time in more than 50 years.
Rest now. The story continues.
We arrive at the end of our story. Though it is not an end, it is a beginning. It is the 1st of April, 2026. Kennedy Space Center, Florida. Late afternoon. The sky turning gold over the Atlantic. On Launch Complex 39B, the most powerful rocket NASA has ever built stands ready. The Space Launch System, 111 meters tall, capable of generating more thrust at liftoff than any rocket in human history, except the Saturn V, the rocket that carried 12 men to the moon more than 50 years ago. Inside the Orion capsule, at the top of the rocket, sit 4 astronauts. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, Jeremy Hansen, 3 Americans and 1 Canadian, the crew of Artemis II. They're going where no human being has gone since Eugene Cernan climbed the ladder of Apollo 17 and said goodbye to the moon in December 1972. They are not landing, not yet. This mission is a flyby, a crude loop around the moon, testing the systems, the life support, the navigation, the heat shield that must protect them on the way home. But they will go further from the Earth than any human being has ever traveled. Farther than the Apollo astronauts, farther than anyone in the history of our species. At 6:35 in the evening, the engines ignite. The ground shakes, the air shakes, the people watching from the beaches and the roads and the rooftops of Florida feel it in their chests. Artemis II rises, and as it climbs through the golden sky toward the darkness above, something stirs in the hearts of the people watching. Something ancient, something that has been there since the first human being looked up at the moon and wondered. We are still wondering. We are still going. From Sputnik's small beep in the autumn of 1957 to a rocket rising in the spring of 2026, nearly 70 years of dreaming and building and failing and learning and trying again. Of Alan Shepard's 15 minutes, of John Glenn's 3 orbits, of Kennedy's promise, of 12 men on the moon, of Apollo 13 coming home, of Challenger's 73 seconds, of Hubble's impossible images, of Columbia's last morning, of rovers rolling across the red silence of Mars, of the station circling overhead every 90 minutes with its lights on. Of all the people who gave everything, whose names are carved into walls and craters in the hearts of everyone who remembers them. Tonight we have followed that story together, from its frightened beginning to this moment of return. 4 astronauts traveling to the moon, and the long journey continues. Now rest. The story has been told. Sleep well.